far with the conversation on Punjab National Bank. The bank has said that it will be making good on 6,500 crore in fraudulent LOUs in the fourth quarter. The remaining LOUs will be made good as and when they come due. But how will this be accounted for? Joining us now is Mr. Santhanakrishnan, Managing Partner at PKF, to help us understand this better. Very good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. So, this is a slightly sort of tricky issue because these were contingent liabilities on the bank's books. We just want to understand, and, basic question to you first. How does the bank start accounting for these? Because it has said that it will make good on 6,500 crore immediately. Excuse me.
Under the present accounting standards, as well as the accounting principles that all countries follow, it's not with reference to India alone, across the world, is the moment of the loss is determined and you know the loss, you provide for it. You don't wait for the next quarter to come, because when you know that a fraudulent action has taken place, you take the whole of the losses and account for it in the same quarter. I don't think any accounting principles are there which will allow you to defer this to the next quarter. In my opinion, PNB will have to provide, will have to look at all those LOUs, see what are bad, and they will have to provide it today itself. Conservatism in loss making and provision for loss making.
I'll get to the RBI circular, which does seem to permit 4 quarters in a minute, sir. But very specifically, so if you look at the PNB balance sheet, it gets deducted from the reserves and surplus first, because the RBI circular seems to say that you have to account for it in a manner that you adjust the reserves against this. This was a contingent liability after all, sir.
It was a contingent liability as far as the transaction is not fraudulent. If it is fraudulent, it is no longer a contingent liability, it is a crystallized liability. There is a distinction between a contingent liability and a liability which has arisen. When you had an LOU, it was a contingent liability. When you find an LOU is fraudulent, it is no longer a contingent liability. Second, the regulatory forbearing or regulatory override does not override accounting. The regulator may say, in order not to create panic in the market, you provide over 4 quarters. But in a fraud transaction, it is never done in a 4 quarter. Even the RBI circular should be looked at from a fraud angle and not from a circular which is generally applicable. For example, you provide for the gratuity, which is 20 lakhs now. You provide additional gratuity liability during the current year. You may provide it over 4 quarters because it's applicable throughout the year. But a loss which you have made is not applicable over the whole year. It has to be provided for in the quarter in which you determine and cannot be deferred, even according to this RBI circular. And removing it from the reserve and not routing it through P&L account is more a regulatory override and not an accounting override. Regulators have a right to determine how to account it, but accountants need not necessarily agree with the regulator's view.
So,
I hope I've made it clear.
Yes, but just to get a little bit more clarity, so when the PNB numbers come, where do we see it? We see it in the provisions, we see it in the other liabilities part on the capital liability side of the balance sheet, sir?
No, it has to go through very clearly the P&L account. Yeah. We will say provision for fraudulent transactions, because it continues as a provision until finally it is determined. So instead of 11,000 crores, it might become 11,500 or 10,000 crores, depending on how much you will be able to realize from Nirav Modi. Therefore, it remains as a provision for expenditure or provision for fraudulent transaction. That provision is shown in the P&L account as losses after provisions, and that is adjusted against the reserve. There are very, very clear accounting methodology adopted for this. Accounting principles do not allow you to adjust anything against reserves directly. It has to go through P&L account, because losses for the current year includes these fraudulent transactions.
So will there be a distinction, sorry, last question to me before I throw it over to Menka. Will there be a distinction between the 6,500 crore that they've said they're paying out immediately at the end of this quarter and the remaining amount which will come due, and how the two buckets will be accounted for, sir?
Completely no. There can't be any difference between 6,000 you have determined.
Yes.
4,500 you have identified, you are yet to determine the full amount. That's only more of a semantics. You know that the entire liability is going to come. So you have to provide only in the quarter in which you identified.
Okay, so the 6,500 crores approximately would have to be accounted for in the quarter ended March 31st. The remaining will be accounted for in whichever quarter those LOUs come up for, some sort of whatever fulfillment, if I can use that word, sir. And accordingly, we'll see those losses take place in subsequent quarters. Is that a fair understanding of it?
No.
No?
No. I'm saying the entire 11,000 crores will have to be determined in the current quarter.
Oh.
You will say that in the balance sheet, 6,500 crores has been determined.
Okay.
4,500 crores, which are maturing in the subsequent quarters, are under process of final figure being crystallized. But you will have to provide 6,500 definite and an approximate amount for 4,500 crores. But in this case, bank will know exactly the amount. There is nothing which is going to change in the next quarters. It is mandatory for you to provide it now.
And as and when you recover from Nirav Modi or the entities involved there, then you write back? Is that how it works?
You can write back saying I am a recovered amount out of the fraudulent transaction.
Okay.
Even RBI says frauds will have to be provided in the same year.
So we're talking about taking the full 11,000 or 12,000 crores, or now it seems to have gone up to 13,000 crores will have to be accounted for in the March quarter. In the March ended quarter, let me put it that way, the fourth quarter
March
of the
ended quarter.
Wow.
Yeah. Supposing had this transaction been found out in the first quarter, RBI would have permitted you after a disclosure to provide over 4 quarters. But you can't escape the current year. It has to be in the current year.
Okay. And all of this, as you pointed out, will have to go through the P&L. I understand that as well. So we're looking at a very massive profit hit, at PNB on account of this.
Absolutely. This will be inevitable.
Okay. I have one more question, sir. Maybe some of these liabilities will come to light. I use the word liabilities loosely, not in the strictest of accounting audit words, but some of these liabilities pertaining to this fraud will come to light only in subsequent months or quarters. Now, I don't know if we have any clarity on the application of Indian accounting standards to the banking sector. It was supposed to kick off this month itself or this financial year. Will that change anything?
No, it has to kick off only. There are very clear accounting principles involved, whether it is a bank or insurance or a private sector enterprise. Even RBI circular very clearly says a fraud will have to be provided in the same year. Only thing is, it is permitted, as I called it, as override, regulatory override, to provide over 4 quarters. That does not find favor with the accounting principles. Now, in accordance with the internationally accepted accounting principles, you will have to provide in the same financial year and in the same quarter in this case.
So you're saying the implementation of Ind AS, which is the IFRS version of Indian accounting standards, that will not change any of what you've already explained to us, which will be the potential impact. That will only exacerbate the potential impact.
In fact, the little ambiguity which one could have had because of RBI clarification is also lost, because Ind AS is absolutely clear. It is exactly in line with what we were following earlier also.
Okay. Mr. Santhanakrishnan, is there anything else that you would advise us or rather advise investors and stakeholders to watch out for in the numbers, as we try and understand the implications of this fraud on the financials of PNB in this quarter that's just finished and the quarters to come?
PNB is certainly going to have not only the problem of this fraud, also a huge book that they have. Consequently, they will have a huge amount of NPA book also is running. The investors may certainly have to look at their restructured debts, their CDR. Most of the restructured debts and CDRs don't really come back. They are only deferred because of no other option. So I think investors will have to certainly look at not this fraud alone, which indicates very poor internal control. I'm not saying other banks may have a better control, but at least in this case, they have been taken for a ride. And big NPA book that is possible also will have to be certainly looked at. And the amount of jewelry exposure or sectoral exposure, I may say, the sectoral exposure is large. The problems of the sector will also come on to PNB's balance sheet.
So just one last quick question. So on the capital adequacy side, sir, this impacts the CET1 ratio, sir?
Certainly it will impact the ratios. All ratios will be impacted.
Okay. Got that, sir.
Okay, so one final question actually before we let you go, Mr. Santhanakrishnan. There has been a lot of conversation on the responsibility of both the internal and external auditors in having failed to detect this huge liability, to a creditor that wasn't even recognized as a creditor, by the bank for many, many months and quarters and maybe even years. In your assessment, where does the responsibility lie? What should regulators be looking at? Internal auditors, external auditors, the full bunch?
See, I think, though I belong to the auditing community, I have to be forthright with you here. If we are going to say, I agree that it's very difficult for auditors to find out. But what is important is, I think we had Arshad Mehta, we had Ketan Parekh, we had Satyam. Every time human ingenuity finds a new fraud, we all come back and talk about it. The auditing community will have to improve. Certainly, if the auditors are going to say they are not responsible, investors may ask you, why have an audit at all? The reason for having an audit is to find out this. But to be fair to the auditing community, SEBI as well as the regulator must prevent the auditors from doing it in 3 days. There is an enormous ego trip by everybody saying we want to finish the audit in 3 days. We want to finish the audit in 5 days. We want to print our balance sheet on April 15. I don't know why we should be doing all this. The problem is shrinking timeline for audit and quarterly announcement of results is certainly taking a toll on the quality of the audit. 1. 2, the auditors will have to continuously look for fraud-prone areas, change the method of audit, rather than saying the audit cannot find out. I agree, today's audit system may not find out, but investors are not worried about it. If you can't find this out, why have an audit could be a legitimate question by the regulator, by the government, and also by the investors. I think auditing community will have to change the method of working and will have to detect such large-scale fraud. I can understand 10,000 rupees not being found, but 11,000 crores certainly wakes up every citizen of this country questioning where are we and what are we doing.
We appreciate you joining us this morning with your thoughts, Mr. Santhanakrishnan. Thank you very much. Surely not going to be the last word being said with regards to the responsibility of the auditor.